We've talked numerous times on this channel about how to pick the right bike for yourself, and yet as silly as it sounds, I think sometimes the bike chooses you. I didn't think I was ever gonna buy a Softail Slim, and yet here we are. And I guess now that that's out of the way, all I can do is review the bike. What's up guys, this is Nick from Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson, and today we're taking a look at the Softail Slim. If you're in the market for a new bike, reach out to us. We'd love to talk and help you out with our no markup pricing. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Softail Slim, one of my favorite Softails since its redesign in 2018. In front of us, we've got a 2020 in vivid black denim. Of course, it features the Milwaukee 8 in the 107 variety. Plenty of grunt for a bike like this. 5-gallon tank with that amazing tank badge, which we'll get a few more shots of as we go forward. This is the cam cover, and as you can see in these shots, along with the rocker box, you've got this really nice polished finish with the black wrinkle coat fins. I think Harley did an amazing job choosing metals and mixing materials on this bike. Lots of polished aluminum, lots of powder coated black. Overall, I think the bike really achieves that look of minimalist while not losing its premium design overall. It's one of my favorite looking bikes, as I mentioned before. Of course, you do get the 7-inch Daymaker, and a little bit later on in this video, you see a nice shot of it running. The fork lowers are black, and the wheel itself, other than the spokes, is all blacked out too. We've got a nice chunky tire on there from Dunlop. It's going to help absorb some of the imperfections in the pavement, and you got a nice kind of squared off fender that has a little bit of a width to it, but still has that bobber look. Of course, I think some guys are going to take the fender off and just run it, pure bobber style, but obviously, there's some drawbacks to that. Here we see the single disc 4-piston caliper setup that you have for your front brakes. It works really, really well, especially after you've ridden the previous generation Softail back to back with this. There's really no comparison. I don't like saying this, but I don't know exactly what they did to improve that brake feel, but whatever they did, it really did distinguish itself on our ride. You can see the 4-plug setup of this. You've got 2 spark plugs per cylinder, and of course 4 valves per cylinder, hence the name Milwaukee 8. The Slim does come with the floorboard setup, which I think it really orients itself towards comfort overall. It's not going to be as performance focused as some of the other Softails, but I think that's fine. I think that this bike is more of the traditional cruiser. You've got the polished aluminum primary cover and the chrome derby cover, which I think is a nice mix of metals. Again, as I said, I think Harley just really knocked it out of the park with their choice of materials on this bike. The classic Harley-Davidson badge there it's got to be my favorite badge in the lineup currently, and there's some really good competition in that department, so that's saying a lot. You've got the mixed metal finishes on the rear sprocket. You've got the inner portion, which has got the wrinkle coat, and the outer portion, which is a polished aluminum for the belt. And overall, I think it's just an awesome looking bike in terms of material choices. There's some debate on why the Slim is called the Slim. In this case, you can kind of see that rear tire has got a nice slim profile, and that's one of the theories, but I can't say for certain that that's why it's called what it is. Here's a shot of the swing arm and the rear brake. You can even see that just like on the front brake, you've got the Harley-Davidson badge on the rear caliper. Just nice attention to detail on something that really is going to be very rarely seen. The oil cap and dipstick is seen here. And behind that, you can get to the transmission fill hole, which doesn't require the removal of the rear tire, and thumbs up if you get that reference. But overall, this bike does a great job of hitting that post-war aesthetic, where it's a very minimalist design, almost reminiscent of the bikes that were going to be used by the U.S. Army during World War II. And overall, I think it's a really clean, simple, honest design, and it really resonates with me. We've got a large center speedometer. Below that in the digital setup, you do have a tachometer as well, along with the fuel gauge. So there's a lot of practical information that's provided. The tank is 5 gallons, and the controls are very simple and black and straightforward. I'm a big fan of this. I don't like when there's large red buttons on the controls. I think it's distracting. It looks cheap, plasticky, and I think Harley does their controls better than pretty much anyone else. The risers are one of the few places where you're going to find chrome on the bike, and you've got that badge there, which I think looks great. You've got 2 gas caps, as it would appear, but actually only the right side is for gas. Left side is just there for symmetry. And the Daymaker is forever one of my favorite headlights. You got a really nice halo setup in front, but with those 2 cutouts towards the middle section of the headlight overall, it just really separates itself from the aftermarket brands that are just a pure ring around the bike. Just another design element that I think separates the bike overall. But the bike is gorgeous. It's just perfect, really.
All right guys, so let's talk about the Softail Slim for a minute. So I still remember when the Softail Slim first came out actually. It was actually a mid-model year launch back in the 2012 model year. It was released with the 72 as well. Some of you may remember the 72 as a Sportster bike that was named after Highway 72 Whittier Boulevard. Kind of a different style. It's kind of like your lowrider style. But the Slim really goes for that post-World War II era look. If you look back at a lot of the bikes that were used during World War II, this kind of resembles those bikes as well. So I usually tell people that are buying a Slim is you're really buying like an era-specific bike or something that was modeled and characterized and stylized after a certain era in Harley-Davidson's history, right there in like the late 40s, early 50s, right around that time period. And a lot of that comes from certain parts on the bike. You have the spoke wheels that are black rimmed. You have what they call the Hollywood bar, which is this cross member on the bars there, which is very indicative of what the bars looked like back in that era as well. But the Slim 2, when I first heard the name Slim, I think of kind of a common nickname that was given to like the bigger guy in the group or the bigger like bruiser guy. They called him Slim. And maybe they named it after that, I don't know. But I know too that the rear tire is a little bit more slim than most of the Softails as well. So maybe it was named after the rear tire. I've heard contradicting theories on where the name came from. I guess I should probably ask someone from Harley Motor Company where they get the name Slim. But I just feel like it's like one of those common nicknames that were back in the, like I mentioned, early 50s. But the Slim is a really cool bike because you get a really classic Harley-Davidson look on the bike that is very well known during that time period around World War II. And for today's purposes, you have the new 2018 Softail chassis, which from 2012 to 2017 it was on the old Softail frame, and then in the 2018 model year, the new frame, as many of you know, was a huge upgrade for the Softail family. So after the 2018 frame change, this bike performs a heck of a lot better than the old Softail frame did, and I mentioned that a lot in my videos, so maybe you guys are sick of hearing about it, but it's a really important point if you're looking at a pre-owned Slim. The difference between a 17 and an 18 is 100% different. You've got the Milwaukee 8 and the 18 model year and newer, and you have the old twin cam in the 2017 and older. You also had at one point you had a Slim S, which was kind of a cool bike that was around, I want to say, in the 16 and 17 model year with the 110 cubic inch. But from a power and performance standpoint, the 107 puts up about the same numbers as the 110 did, with a lot less of the heat. So the Milwaukee 8 definitely being the superior engine here as well. But yeah, the Slim, everything from the ribbed seat, you have a ribbed solo seat on there as well. Really the guys I'd recommend the Slim to are the guys that like this style, like that look a lot, but more importantly than that, have kind of determined and narrowed it down that they definitely want the Softail frame. And that's kind of my pecking order, or where I kind of guide people to choose first from. Okay, do you want the Sportster frame, the Softail frame, or do you want the Touring chassis frame? Nowadays, now they've gotten rid of the Dyna and combined both those models into one family. It kind of simplifies things quite a bit from a standpoint of what mid-range bike you should get. So if you're someone that maybe doesn't do as much touring, doesn't have a need for the storage that the Touring chassis bikes are going to give you, then go for the Softail. If you're someone who's newer that's trying to make that decision between a Sportster and a Softail, well, if you're going to be doing a little bit more of the high-speed riding, you want more of the power, you've got about a 1750cc engine in this. You have a 6-speed transmission, so definitely better up at speeds when you compare it to a Sportster. So if you want something in Harley-Davidson's mid-range, but you don't need as much of like the touring or two-up functionality, and you really like the style of the Slim as well, then the Slim is probably a safe bet for you. It can ride 2-up, of course. Of course, you'd have to incur the additional expense of a passenger seat, and then most passengers want the sissy bar as well, the backrest. So you'll have to incur that expense as well. Can bags be added to this? Absolutely. Of course, now you're looking at an additional expense. So, yeah, like I said, the guys that really like this style, then maybe don't need the functionality of the 2-up seats and the storage, things like that, then this bike is going to do real well for you. It has floorboards, which typically speaking, the floorboards are more of a comfort move than like a peg. So one more thing that kind of lends towards a real classic, pure cruiser bike on this motorcycle. When you compare it to like a Street Bob or like a Fat Bob or like a Lowrider S, those bikes are bikes that you're going to get if you want more of that ride it hard, aggressive type of riding style. You're not going to get as much of a lean angle on this bike as you will like on a Fat Bob, for instance. So you're going to scrape sooner if you're really putting it into the turns real quick. So again, one more thing to kind of really make this a real pure cruiser, as I mentioned already. As far as pricing goes, and you compare this to the other Softails, it's kind of a mid-tier as far as the Softails are concerned. It's not the lowest end of the tier like a Street Bob is. Of course, you have the 5-gallon tank in this. So this kind of goes for that Street Bob bobber look as well, with the chopped fenders and everything, but it does have the 5-gallon tank as opposed to 3.5 like a Street Bob does. So again, I feel like this bike is a little bit better for more of long rides and cruises and things like that than like a Street Bob would. But it's not as expensive as say like your Lowrider S or your Fat Bob or your Heritage for that matter. And of course the Heritage comes in black as well. If you like this bike, you kind of like this style with the spoke wheels and everything, but you want things like the 2-up riding with the storage, and I'd probably steer you towards the Heritage over the Slim. But if you like the really just chopped down, minimalist look, real indicative of that era like I mentioned already, then the Slim is probably a really good bet for you. A couple things too that I'll mention about the finishes. You've got just like the raw aluminum on like the rocker box covers and the cam timer cover. That's kind of, again, one of those things that kind of plays into that real raw military look like they had. No chrome on this. It's just very much your black and raw aluminum to once again kind of give it that look of, hey, this thing could have just come off of the front lines and into your hands. And so you've got, I guess, little touches like around the headlamp that's chrome, but very minimal chrome on the bike, just to kind of make it give you that real rugged look once again.
So Matt and I just got off of the Softail Slim, and what really took me aback was something that I, intellectually I knew, but it just was something I had never really thought about, that this currently rides on the same chassis as the Lowrider S and as the Fat Bob. And that's amazing, because really, my perspective of those bikes, the Lowrider S and the Fat Bob, has really been shaped by sort of my own bikes that I've focused on personally, which would be like the FXR and then, the Dyna frame, because I've always had kind of one Harley, so I've always needed to be a jack of all trades. It needs to be fun in the canyons, it needs to be good out on the highway, it needs to be able to do two-up riding, touring, and everything like that. And the previous generation Softail frame wasn't that you couldn't do those things, but the Dyna and the FXR were just a lot better at those things. Whereas, something like a Deluxe or a Slim, you were dragging floorboard a lot sooner. You were, if you were doing two-up riding, adjusting the suspension for preload it just wasn't something that you would regularly do, which meant that you were much more likely to bottom it out. It was a bike that really was geared towards Sunday cruises at the beach and geared towards just being this beautiful piece of art. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's what lines up your riding style, then the Softail was a great bike, but it didn't really line up for what I wanted to do. And so it's funny now because I get on a bike like the Slim here, which is a bike I've always loved the looks of, and I forgot that this is essentially the bones of what makes something like the new Lowrider S or the new Fat Bob such a great bike. Now, do you sacrifice lean angle? Do you sacrifice some of the twitchiness of the front end in the canyons with the additional rake on this? Of course, obviously this doesn't perform at the level of those bikes, but the architecture for how well the suspension is going to handle two-up riding and the brake feel, for example, is just a lot more sporty. You don't get as much brake dive as you did on those other bikes. When you're leaning them over, it doesn't on paper look like it has have a lot more lean angle than the previous generation, but a few degrees increase like this has is actually a pretty significant percentage increase. You can actually lean a lot more. When I was following Matt on the test ride, I noticed him actually dragging a few places that I wasn't even close to dragging. And so I was just able to carry a lot more speed through those corners than Matt could. Which, might say, oh, well, I was never really pushing my Softail to the limit, so, it doesn't really matter if I'm dragging. And I understand that argument, and I think that applies here to the new Softail, but on the previous generation Softail, when I was just trying to ride normally, I would end up dragging board pretty regularly. Just trying to ride at a normal pace, not like a, really fast pace. So this kind of eliminates that problem entirely, the new frame does. You can ride it without really thinking about any of that stuff, because unless you're really pushing it on a canyon road, you're not going to be dragging board everywhere. Maybe really slow in a parking lot, you're trying to make a really tight turn and you're leaning away over. I'm sure there's going to be people that say, oh, well, I still drag the board on my new Softail everywhere. Maybe you ride a lot faster than I do regularly. Obviously we all have different perspectives on that, but I still think it's a pretty significant increase over the previous generation. And so what I really ended up thinking was that these bikes now, to me, represent really well-rounded bikes that you can purchase and do pretty much anything with, especially if you're willing to consider a few modifications that you may have been doing anyways, such as a back seat, rear passenger pegs, and that kind of stuff, depending on the model that you look at. Whereas previously, I would have probably pushed people away from certain Softails. If they came in, they're like, oh, I love the look of the Deluxe, but I'm going to be doing a lot of long distance two-up riding. I would have been like, hey, I wouldn't even consider the Deluxe in that case. I would go right for the Road King. And now I would still say, hey, consider the Road King. The Road King is going to be better out on the open highway. It's going to be better for two-up riding. You're going to have more comfortable seat options. You're going to have a bigger backrest, 6-gallon tank, hard bags from the factory. You're going to have advantages, don't get me wrong. But it's now close enough where you might be willing to make the compromise of going with the Softail frame, and you probably won't be disappointed, especially if most of your riding is still highway commuting, around town stuff with the occasional trip out on the two-lane highways far out of town with two-up riding. So it's just moved the whole frame's capabilities close enough to the other categories of the bikes where they become really great jack-of-all-trade bikes. They feel light and nimble like the Sportsters do, but they also have that long-distance, long-range touring capability like the touring bikes do. Are they as good as those bikes in those specific categories? No, but they certainly blend all of the features that you want better than they ever have before. And so it's almost like something that I just really hadn't remembered, that I should have intellectually known, but had just never really thought about, because I'd never really considered these bikes personally for my own ownership. And now I can, because they perform better than the Dynas. They perform better than the FXRs, at least in stock form. And sure, you might give up a little bit of lean angle, but the stability you get mid-corner, the suspension performance that you're getting, there's so many advantages to the new frame that it really actually starting to make me consider the Softail models that I would have potentially previously just dismissed.